All right, Carlton, we got her. We got Steph Smith, who I started the interview with her saying, you got to kiss up a little bit. I was telling her
Yeah.
how she, is a very sought after guest. She pushed back in that in humility, but the truth is, I don't know. There's a few names that you see around. I would say Steph Smith is one of the most popular right now. What do you think about it?
One of those things is that her side projects are pretty incredible for being side projects,
Hmm.
and somehow she manages to have a pretty important job at Trends and then HubSpot, and definitely doing a ton of content work, and then jumping over when she's done with that and creating a ton of content as well for her side projects. So she's got this course doing time right, and after listening to that episode, I'm even more convinced that I need
Are
to
you in?
take it.
Yeah,
I haven't
that's
paid
the
the
hope.
yeah, I haven't
We'll
paid the
we'll
money
have to
yet.
link that for people below. But yeah, I mean, her attitude. I think her methodology. She goes into a little bit about sprinting. Doing these sprints, and you hear that all the time, right? Like everyone reads the Naval tweets, so everyone kind of has
Yeah,
the sense of it. But this is someone who is actually executing on that and is doing something. Like my takeaway from that was, first of all, I overthink projects. I think Steph talked a lot about how to make decisions and pick projects to work on. I definitely am just hurting myself by overthinking them. But then she takes a simple problem, usually a problem that's her own, and then executes really hard for a season and then moves on to the next thing. And the
yeah,
result of that is like this pyramid of really great projects. I
yeah,
think
and
the other thing I was just going to say is she bridged into some of the newer media stuff. What did you think about that as someone who, I mean, that's what our business is, providing those services for other companies.
yeah, absolutely. So with there's this cycle in technology and in how it's associated with media, and it starts in a certain form and kind of transfers and converts into something different. It morphs, it changes. So, with written word, that's been around forever. And she touches on how that's changed and some of the ways that the methods that people use when creating change. And so we're kind of at that infant stage for podcasting. I think you could kind of lump that in with audio, and podcasting is another morph of audio.
Hmm.
But I think as a show medium or um, as something that is long form content, I think we're still at this infant stage. And just like you're seeing YouTube creators doing interesting things, I think there's so much room for innovation in the podcast space, and especially when it comes to something I've thought a lot about is interactivity in the podcast space.
Mm,
As things become a little bit more easy with our voices to interact with, I think there's going to be a lot more technology around that, whether it's user interaction or guest interaction or different things that AI or voice interaction can improve upon.
yeah. I was just excited. This is super selfish, but I was just excited as people who have been now for the last, 4 or 5 years saying podcast. And it almost feels old at this point to hear someone who,
Yeah,
and if you don't know Steph, she spends all of her working hours researching what is going to be the next big thing, right? Like that is her job for a huge company that depends on it. And so for her to say the thing that she's most excited about within content is the future of podcasting just was
yeah,
affirming and got me really excited in a new way again about, we're just scratching the surface and there's a lot of
absolutely.
work for us and for the industry to keep moving it forward. So anything else before we get into it?
Well, I was going to say back on that whole work like a lion thing. If you
Yeah.
were to extend that analogy further, lions are pretty successful at getting their kills, and I
Fairly,
think,
yes.
yeah, I think there's like something to be thought about with that. There's times where people pick projects because that's what's at their doorstep. And one point she made that was very good and very helpful for me was if you don't feel absolutely thrilled about the project, then don't do it.
Mm,
If it's not something that is going to be a home run, then then look for something different. And I think there's times in my life where the opportunity that's come up just seems obvious, or someone just asked me to, so I feel obligated to say yes. But a lot of times it's not something I'm super passionate about. And if I had taken that time instead and focused on the things that were awesome and interesting, and set kind of like a way to make it sustainable and not like gotten myself like neck deep in this project that that doesn't have an exit date, then I could have produced something else. So I
mhm.
think that was a good takeaway as well. Hopefully, we're not just repeating too much of what she said in a non or as not as articulate as she did it. But
No, no, I totally see what you're saying, and I think her answer to that, she explains why that's the truth, what you said, and then how for someone like me, and for probably a lot of people listening, it's less like, yeah, I believe that, but how do I pick the thing then, and how do I make that decision? And I think she explained really well in the episode how to do that. So excited for everyone to get into listen to it. Let's get into it with Steph Smith. On today's episode, we have Steph Smith. Steph is the director and head of premium products at HubSpot. Prior to that, she led the popular trends product for The Hustle, and she's also the author of Doing Content Right, which is a primer on how to build audiences and leverage the internet for growth. All of this she does in addition to her coding, creating, publishing, and podcasting over at stephsmith.io. Steph joined the show to talk about how she balances all the work I just listed with her full-time job at HubSpot, how she views content and products as leverage for her career in totality, and what has her most excited right now in the content space. I was obviously thrilled to get Steph on the show. I think she provided massive value in this interview and that you'll enjoy it too. Let's get into it with Steph Smith. There we go. All right, we've got Steph Smith here on the show. Steph, thank you so much for joining us. Obviously, a very in-demand guest on tons of shows, but we're so glad to have you.
Thank you. And I don't know if I'm that in demand, but really happy to be here.
I don't know. This is what we need. Where we need to start. It's been I would imagine, your mentions and things like that blow up whenever you have appearances. I saw, so for context for the listener, Steph was on My First Million at the end of last week. And then Sam was tweeting about doing some type of conference or something. And somehow that whole thread turned into, actually, let's just make it a Steph Smith conference. Forget about the My First.
Those are just all my fake accounts. No,
Which was
I'm
so
kidding.
funny.
You know what? Sam did that to himself because him and Sean, they're always very nice, but on that latest episode, they were extremely nice, and they said I had like a 98% approval rating. You know what's funny about just online
Yeah.
influence is that one thing I've learned is that people are very readily accepting of narratives that other people tell them. So just the fact that Sam and Sean said that a lot of people like me, I feel like all of a sudden people have now adopted that, and I guess positive for me in this case. But yeah, but I mean, Sam did that to himself by being so nice.
What is that? Is that like, is it fun when that happens and you get blown up like that? Is it overwhelming? Is it distracting? Or is it just kind of like something you've become accustomed to?
These days, it doesn't really change much. When I first was building an audience, I have to say, and I think anyone that would say otherwise would be lying, that it was very fun to like get a shout out or to, especially if it was someone that I respected or I followed. I was like, oh my God, like this person's tweeting at me, or this person like has encountered me on the interwebs. It was very exciting. These days, since I have grown an audience, this is my 4th time on My First Million, I'm a little more used to it, but I still, have to admit, it gives you a little dopamine boost. It has to, right? You're not human if that doesn't happen. I will say the downside to it that I have become more aware of is that the more positive you get when those things happens, there's the flip side of that, which is when those don't happen, or when you get someone calling you out for something you don't like, it's that much easier to go down into a more negative spiral or reaction. So you have to kind of like, I mean, the Stoics say like, don't respond at all. I do have positive feelings when some of those things happen, but I have to like keep myself in check.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd imagine that could be overwhelming if you allowed it to. Well, the reason that people are, interested in hearing what you have to say, and even the reason that they follow you and you have all of this audience is for a bunch of different things. But I think one of them is the uniqueness of how many different channels and how many different sort of avenues you've investigated fairly deeply when it comes to business and content and all those sorts of things. And specifically, so this show, for quick context, is for marketers, startups, and maybe some entrepreneurs who are trying to use content as leverage, right? Essentially, and I think one of the things that can happen is you maybe are good at writing, or you're good at building, or you're good at whatever. You do a bunch of these things, so I'm just curious, how do you switch mentalities from maybe something that's more creative and like writing focused to coding and building a platform or something like that? Like what does that look like for you on a maker
Yeah,
basis?
so I think over time I've been able to kind of pivot between those different areas because I've taught myself to like embrace that beginner stage of learning whatever skill it is, whether it's cooking or surfing or coding. I think a lot of people end up like wrapping themselves in a particular identity. Like, I am a creative, or I am a developer, I'm super technical, whatever it might be. And I think I've had the luxury of early on encountering many of those spaces. So I did my degree in chemical engineering. Over time, somehow found myself more in the like writing or marketing space. And then, throughout time, I've kind of like forced myself to go learn new things that seem very foreign to me. And so now I will say that
Mhm.
encountering something new comes a little more naturally to me than it did 5 years ago. And so it's not as overwhelming as when I did first learn to code. I was like, shit, this is really hard. I have no idea what I'm doing. This feels very, very different to what I've done before. And so, yeah, now I actually enjoy the diversity in the projects that I focus on. And I will say that every time I've learned something, maybe one difference in the way I approach it is I feel like a lot of people will like dabble very, very high level. They'll be like, oh, I'm going to start tweeting, and they'll tweet like once a quarter, and they'll be like, oh, that's not really for me. Or they'll
Mm.
take like one coding lesson, and then they'll be like, that was really hard, and I'm never going to go back to that. With everything that I've done, I've really, really focused on that given thing for a period of time until it feels remotely comfortable. So, just to give a couple quick examples, when I launched my podcast last year, we did a 30-day challenge to make sure that it was something we wanted to do, but also something that we could do for 30 days before we decided to continue forward with it. When I taught myself to code, that entire year was basically dedicated to that outside of my full-time job. It was like, let me learn to
Wow.
code, let me track how often I'm doing this. I kind of built like 4 or 5 projects that given year. Same thing happened with my blog. I don't write as much these days, but in 2019, when I launched it, that year, I think I wrote not even that many, but somewhere around 20 articles, and 4 out of them trended on Hacker News because I was so focused on writing and publishing and marketing that particular thing. And so I think, if people are going to take one thing
Mhm.
away, I may do a lot of things now, but I do them almost in like seasons, because I think if you're trying to tackle all of them at once, you're going to end up being successful at none of them.
Yeah, and that's also just part of your unique skill, right? Like even with what you did with trends, or I'm not sure, you don't do you still run
So
trends?
I lead the product manager we hired to run it. So I'm not actually in the weeds as much these days.
Gotcha. Okay. But the idea behind that was, finding or explaining trends or explaining the new business opportunities, et cetera. So there's always that like novelty. So maybe that's a unique skill. But even when you were doing that, I would say from the outside, it looks like Steph is like this curator of ideas and new businesses, and you're able to like select. Is there a go-to when you're like, okay, I want to decide to learn about X, whatever it might be? Do you have a go-to area or process or resource to get started on that, or it just can depend because they're so
I mean,
wildly
they are
different?
so widely different, so there isn't like a concrete process, but I will say one thing that I do, or I have done
Yeah.
for each of them, that I kind of alluded to, is tracking and really like going down that rabbit hole. So not just like attempting it lightly for a couple of days. Like in the case of coding, again, I had a spreadsheet where every single day I would track, did I spend time on coding or did I not? So by the end of that year, I knew
Mm.
exactly how much time I had spent learning to code and also spending time on building coding projects. And in that case, it was over 300 hours. So that is like not a light investment into that
Mm.
particular thing. With something like podcasting, I was drawn to that because I had been on a couple podcasts, so I'd kind of test out whether that was something I wanted to do. And then once I decided I want to do this myself, again, there was that 30-day challenge. And then I just like went down the rabbit hole. I tried to look up all of the podcasts where people talked about how they grew their podcasts, tried to talk to other podcasters. I got involved at HubSpot and My First Million more and the back end of that and seeing how they were learning. And so is that description super helpful for other people? Probably not, but the idea is that if you do truly want to like dive into something, like really dive into it, become the expert that doesn't even exist, like in podcasting, because it's a new-ish space, especially compared to written content. I would say actually like even the top podcasters out there are really still figuring it out. That's something I learned over the last year of diving in myself. So I would, I guess, encourage people not to feel discouraged that they're like, you know, X years too late, and just like be like, what would it take for me a year from now to be the number one most knowledgeable person on this subject? You probably won't get there, but you'll get pretty far if that's your goal.
Yeah. So just full immersion. I actually think that is very helpful for people because it's not some resource or tool that you can just like tap into, but more of an internal, habitual, sense that you go back to. Full immersion. When you said you did the 300 hours of coding, was that in a
Yes.
year?
Yeah. It was actually in less than a
Wow.
year because I started in maybe like March or so. And
Okay.
I did that because there was several other occasions in my life where I thought, I really should learn to code. Like this is going to be valuable in the
Yeah.
future. And I tried it and I kind of did what I described other people doing. Like I took like an hour of a course, or like I signed up for Code Academy or something and did like one lesson,
Yeah.
and I never got very far. And that year was like almost like looking myself in the mirror and saying, look, this is something that you say is important, but your actions are not matching your words. And so if you truly think this is important and you think this is going to impact you for literally decades, which is what I truly believe, then show up. Like show up and take the actions that your words say you care about. And so that's what I did. And I started again in like March or so and tracked in this spreadsheet. And what was fascinating about it is, even though I look back and I'm like, wow, I did over 300 hours, there was massive chunks where I did not do any coding, right? So it would have been like 3.5 weeks. And in my head, I'm like, oh yeah, I totally did a lesson like 4 days ago. And then I'd look at my spreadsheet and be like, oh, actually, it's been almost a month. And that's really helpful because I think sometimes our brains are so sophisticated that we can trick ourselves into thinking things. And in that case, it just like had a level of accountability to really be like, how much time did you truly spend on this thing that you say is important? And in that case, because I had that tracking mechanism, I could look myself in the mirror and be like, Steph, like get your shit together, actually focus on this if you say it's important.
I love that, the tracking and the accountability. I have to ask you though. You say, okay, so you say like it's valuable. This has nothing to do with content really, but well, first of all, part of this is defense mechanism because I've been the person, like I've probably signed up for like 15 Code Academy things, right? So like, and then each time I go through it a little bit, and then I convince myself, I can't invest time here. Like, has it been worth it to you aside from there's the obvious benefit of you being able to say, I learned how to code, right? And I taught myself and I spent 300 hours, and like there's a whole brand and content thing with that. But like in terms of the skill, has that also been worth the time that you invested?
Yeah, and I think for reasons that people may not expect. So not because I plan to go be hired as like an engineer at Uber or something like that. And actually that was never my intention, even when I was learning. Basically, my impetus for learning at the time was that I wanted to create my own side projects. And I was living in Bali at the time, and I just saw all these other people around me who completely were or I should rather say, they were completely self-capable, right? So every morning they would code their projects, they would design their projects, they would market their projects, they would do their customer service. And I was like, wow, this is so amazing that they don't have to rely on anyone else. So that was the reason at the time. I would say that still is an important reason as to why I learned and why I would encourage other people to learn if they want to pursue that. But actually, the thing that I've learned since is just learning to code has removed a massive black box in my life that
Mm.
I don't think people recognize its significance until they've learned to code, or at least that is my impression. Now that I've learned, am I a great coder? Absolutely not. Am I super far behind, the fringe of innovation? Absolutely. But when I work with a developer, I know what I'm talking about. When I want to understand the direction that technology is moving, like what are the next things that Apple or Facebook or something are going to launch, I have a little bit more of an understanding of why they might pursue that, or what's difficult, what's easy. I also think that I heard someone on podcast recently give this analogy. They were like, if you're going to like go buy a house, of course, I know some people buy them now sight unseen, but like, don't you want to go see your house, see how it works, see what's going on inside, if there's anything really sketchy? And I think there's kind of a similar analogy with learning to code, where I do hope to start my own businesses, or I've hired a bunch of people on large teams now. And when I work with a developer, or when someone else works with a developer, I feel confident in what I'm asking for, if there's anything sketchy about what we're building, and I feel like I understand the house that I'm either building or buying, right? And I think a lot of people
Yeah.
don't have that capability, which is unfortunate to me. And then the final thing I'll say is that I truly believe, and I think a lot of people would agree with me, that technology is the most significant shaping force on our future, right? The products that we work with, but also the society that we're building is like dependent on this technology. And again, without that almost like technical literacy, I think personally technical literacy will be as important as like, written literacy in the next couple decades.
Mhm.
I want to kind of build that future, or be part of that future, or understand it. And I think that, again, removing that black box was essential for me. And I don't think it's kind of like you don't know what you don't know. I don't think that a lot of people who have removed that own black box from their lives know almost like what they're missing.
Great. This interview is going to end up being super costly for me in terms of time, because now I have to go like learn how to do this stuff. No.
I would actually say, like, just as a note, when I say technical literacy, what a lot of people do is they go and learn, they take like a web dev course like
Yeah.
I did, which I think it's like the most straightforward way to learn, because those are the resources out there. But I actually think a gap in the market is to teach people the technical literacy without them actually being in a code
Mhm.
editor, like understanding how do requests work in your browser, or like basics of cybersecurity, or like what is a browser even,
Mhm.
like what is loading on my page, and what's the difference between HTML, CSS, and
Yeah.
JavaScript, and what are the backend languages versus the front end languages. Like understanding the environment that we're in and how technology works, I think, is actually the first step. And there's not really great information out there, because of course all of that information is on Google, but a lot of people would not know what to
Right.
Google,
It's
right,
disparate.
to find those things. And so yeah, I think that is actually what I mean by digital literacy. And then, of course, I would encourage people, if they have the interest, to go further and actually learn to code things themselves. But I don't actually think that everyone in 2050 will absolutely need to be like coding their
Right.
own
Right.
applications, but they will have to understand what other people are doing when they're creating the technology that runs
Yeah.
their lives.
Yeah. It's more like understanding and having being able to play like a product manager role personally, as opposed to being able to maybe like be the full developer. That sounds like a great course idea,
Yeah.
by the way. The like,
Yeah, I've mentioned this on other podcasts before. Someone should go build it. It's been on my like, product building to-do
yeah.
list, and I don't think I'm ever going to get to it, but someone should go create it, and let me know if someone does.
Cool. Okay. Well, I want to get to some of the other things that you have made, but before you do, you touched on briefly there the fact that you do all of this outside of your normal job. And I know they asked you this on the My First Million episode. They asked you like, why don't you just quit your job and whatever. I'm not as interested in
Yeah.
that as and some of this goes to probably your course, doing time right, but how do you just manage to create and output as much as you do while being employed full time? Those just, I don't understand that, just from a basic time constraint.
Yeah. So I guess I have a couple kind of disparate answers that I'll pull together here. So the one thing that I think is really fundamental is that ultimately the only way that you are going to create a lot of things is if you remain interested in creating a lot of things, right? Like that your interest stays the same or increases over time, right? And doesn't die out. And I actually think this is one of the most important things that people don't focus on enough, where you know, I talked about this on the podcast with Sean. He was like, why haven't you quit yet? And ultimately, I know, at least for right now, reflecting on my own habits and interest levels, that if I were to quit and go full time in my own projects, my interest in those projects would go right down into the ground because I'd be spending all my time on them. So instead of them being like a fun, lucrative hobby, they turn into this weight on my psychology. And so I think that's ultimately why sometimes I do push back on people who are like, you should just quit your job and go all in. And they talk about all these like, you know, super risk taking individuals who choose that route. It's not that that doesn't work for everyone, but or it's not that that doesn't work for anyone, but it certainly does not work for everyone.
Right.
And so in my case, I've recognized that about my own psychology. And I'm like, look, I get to work a really, you know, good, in my opinion, full-time job. It keeps me interested. They keep putting me on new projects. As I mentioned, I'm no longer as focused on trends. And so I get that. And then on the side, I only do things that I want to do, only do things that I'm like truly excited to do. I wake up in the morning and I'm like, I could either spend my time like going for a run outside, hanging by the beach, or there's this other thing that's competing with that because I'm truly interested in it. And to that point, I think a lot of people, when they see my output, they think that I'm like always grinding. Now I do work a lot. I spend far too much time on the computer, but I work in these seasons. So like I recognize that I also would burn out if I every day was like, okay, work your full-time job and work on these side projects. And so I try to like package these projects into really discrete periods of time. I mean, I think a lot of people are familiar with Parkinson's law too. So like with my book, a lot of people, if they choose to write a book, they're like, I'm going to write this book over the next couple years, and like eventually they'll write it, but it'll be this like weight on their mind during that whole period. What I chose to do is write it in 50 days. Now, those 50 days were probably more stressful than, you know, that average person who's writing it over 5 years, but it was like in and out, right? Like write it, 50 days, focus, get it all out there, and then I don't have to worry about it again. And I would also say I structure the projects that I build around the psychology too. So a very simple example is when I wrote this book, I wanted to tack on a community, but I didn't want to have this ongoing requirement for me to be heavily involved. So I structured the price point so that it wasn't, you know, a cohort-based course. It wasn't something that people would be like, hey, we want you involved all the time. I paid $1,000 for this. Like, where are you kind of thing. I structured it so that the understanding was that you're buying this from me. It's an asynchronous thing. You do it on your own time. And therefore, like, I can basically move on from this project. And so that's always like kind of at the top of my mind is like, how can I set this up so that I'm creating for the super long term? And so sometimes I make those trade-offs. I mean, I see tons of creators making these cohort-based courses, and they probably make way more than I do, especially on a per sale basis. But what I want to do is just figure out how I can create, you know, for 5 years so far, but also like 50 years moving forward. And so those are some of the, I guess, notes on like how I managed to work on my job full time and then also create on the side. I do think that like idea of creative constraints and setting really rigid deadlines is important, because if you think about, I don't know about you, if I think back to my college days, I'm like, I did a lot. Like I studied like crazy. I was able to attend classes. I like worked part-time jobs. I partied a bunch. Like I was like, how did I do that during that period? And the answer, if I reflect back, are really rigid deadlines. And yet when you're working in like a full-time job or on your side projects, we don't have very many deadlines. We're like, oh, I'll ship that next month, or if it happens to be next quarter, like no worries. So I do think that's a very, very simple way that people can almost like accomplish more by setting super arbitrary, admittedly, but important deadlines in their own lives.
That's so helpful. So if you okay, the threads that I heard while you were saying that was, first of all, understanding your own psychology before you just jump it. So understanding like what actually motivates you, what's important, what do you want objectively to get out of the project, setting super, you know, tight constraints, whether that be having a full-time job, so your time is, you know, just naturally limited, or something else. And then once you decide, sort of sprinting, just going into sprints, which it sounds like is a trend you've done over and over again, whether it be coding or writing the book or that sort of thing. Would you add anything else to that?
Yeah. Well, just on the note of sprinting, I mean, I can't take responsibility for, or I can't say this is my
Yeah, yeah,
own, but people are probably familiar with Naval saying it's like work like
yeah.
a lion instead of a cow. And so I think that most people would benefit from more of that approach. The only reason, I shouldn't say the only, one of the major reasons that we work the way we do in these like 9 to 5, really slow, long, arduous sessions is due to the fact that people needed to do that back in the day. Like the 40-hour work week was invented over a century ago. And we've just adopted a lot of these same practices from the factory
Mm.
days that no longer apply to the information era. And so I think people almost have to like untrain themselves from like this very slow, long work period to something that's more oriented around when they do have a like clear drive to do
Yeah.
something, right? And that is important, not just in the times you work, but again what you work on. Like I think sometimes people are trained within a job to just like, they're handed a project and they're like, okay, I guess I got to do this project, I'm not super stoked about it, and then they apply that in their personal life
Mm.
too. They're like, I guess I'll do this thing, or I guess I'll do like it, as cheesy as it sounds, people like Derek Sivers, like fuck yes or no. It's like you should, if you have a full-time job like I do, your side projects should always be a hell
Yeah.
yes, or
Yeah.
fuck yes, because if not, that's when I've seen tons of creators do things that they may think are sleazy or that they're just not super stoked about, and then they burn out, they disappear, and they aren't creating for, again, that like 5 or even 50-year period that I was talking
Yeah,
about.
and it's so or it's so ingrained. Like I worked in the agency world for many years, worked at VaynerMedia, and so obviously there's like some expectations of time there. And then when I left, I just kept working as if I was still working at Vayner, which I love Vayner, but it's just like, I don't have to do that necessarily. And there's like a
Yeah.
guilt.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's definitely ingrained, but breaking out of that, and that's a good model to help folks break out of it. We only have a couple minutes left, so I want to get from you. I'd like be super remiss if I didn't ask Steph about what content ideas or content trends, and I know that's a little bit specific, but have you most excited or most curious, or that are just on your radar right now that you're interested in?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I will say I know we're on one and I have one as well. I am super interested to see how podcasting evolves. So, if people actually look at the history of these different forms of media, written content, written content's been around since like
Sure.
caveman days, right? They're like scratching on their cave walls. But only in around 2000, I'm forgetting the exact dates, was when WordPress came online, and then only in like the 2010s what did you see like Squarespace or Wix or Ghost, some of these other tools that allowed you to create content and distribute it online effectively. Podcasting, if you look at that same history, is like a decade
Mm.
later. So I think Apple Podcasts became a standalone tool sometime in maybe like 2008. But then again, most of the other tools, whether it's like Megaphone or Castbox or all of these other podcasting tools, happened in the last, let's say, 5 to 10 years, and some of them very, very recently. And so the reason I'm saying this is because what we've seen, and if you like look at these histories, is that once content becomes democratized in that particular form of media, you see this huge surge of people who
Hmm.
play,
Hmm.
right? And you're seeing the same thing with podcasting right now, where you're seeing a ton of people like, and their mom, they're like, everyone has a
Yeah.
podcast. But it does take a couple years for the data or like attribution to catch up. So that's what we're seeing in podcasting. But I also think the creativity within
Yeah.
the space. So if you look at video kind of formats, you said you worked at VaynerMedia. Like if you look at what's going on YouTube, you have people who do like vlogging, but then you also see like product reviews, and then you see people who like are just hanging out with one another versus someone who's like recording something from their bedroom, or like there's so many different forms of video media that people have mastered and come up with, and there's still new ones coming online. And if you think about podcasting, there's very, very limited formats that people have
Hmm.
tried. So, for example, we're on an interview style podcast. There are some like more panel conversational style podcasts. And then there are more typical, like more storytelling, like let's say like true
Yeah.
crime esque
Serial,
podcasts.
etc.
Exactly. And I'm probably missing a bunch, and people will come at me and be like, no, there's tons of variety within podcasts. But if people just Google the like podcast charts out there, it's a lot of it is the
Yeah.
same. And a lot of it's the same because people go to like what's tried and true. But I'm really excited for people to get a little more creative with podcasts. And once we can get better attribution, or like the tooling improves, that's when you're going to see a lot of smaller players rise up the charts. Because right now, the best way to build a podcast audience is actually through another
Anything else,
audience.
yeah.
That's why, exactly, like Tim Ferriss had a newsletter or a book. If you look at the charts, you'll also see people like Michelle Obama or someone in a network like NPR. And so I'm really excited for, I guess, the podcasting industry to mature a little bit, and hopefully through that maturation see like just really interesting formats. So for example, they didn't end up doing it, but when My First Million had Andrew Huberman on, they ended up doing just like a traditional interview style podcast. But one of the ideas I gave them is like, look, what do people really want to know from him? They want to know of all the health information out there, because there's a ton of it, what is actually true and what is not. And so I was like, you should just find all of the kind of like new health tools, whether it's like melatonin, infrared saunas, ice baths, like blue light glasses, whatever it is, like all of these things that people are trying, and just like create a massive list of them, and then get him to go through and like rate them on a scale of like 1 to 10, 1 being like complete bullshit, there is absolutely no scientific backing, to 10 being like there are dozens, if not hundreds, of peer-reviewed studies on this, and it absolutely improves, your health in some tangible way. And so that's an example of like, it's still interview style, but it's like almost like a game, or you could like have podcasts more trivia-esque, or I just think that there's a lot of creativity to
100%.
be added to this
I don't even know if you know this, but that's how, so we produce internet shows. We started just by producing podcasts, and that's kind of expanded. And the big complaint we've always had is that podcasting has just taken radio and I'm doing it. So it's not, but it's just like any format.
No, and for the record, I don't think it's bad that people do this. Like, I just think there's opportunity for newcomers 100%. To just rethink the model.
Because YouTube they don't take what TV has done only and repeat it. You don't just have talking heads or whatever news. And that same thing is, and I think it's starting to happen. I think you're starting to see slowly like the cream of ideas begin to rise to the top, but it's going to take a really long time, because people who have huge audiences, like you said, can bring them over, and so they're at the top naturally. It's going to take years for that transition to happen. But Steph, I'm so thankful for you spending your time with us. I really appreciate you coming on. If people want to check out Doing Time Right or any of the other work that you've put out, and there's a ton of it, what's the best way for them to keep up with what you're doing?
Yeah, so you can find all of my projects at stephsmith.io. I'm also super active on Twitter. My handle there is stephsmith.io because of my site. I also have a podcast, like I mentioned. It's called The Shit You Don't Learn in School, which you can find at listenandlearn.co. And then, as you mentioned, there's Doing Time Right. You can find it at doingtimeright.com. And as I mentioned, you can find all of my other projects at my site.